Thank you. We'll call this this section of our meeting to order. This is an informal discussion with the FAA, most specifically Michael O'Hara from Region 7, who's the administrator there. Thank you all for being here, and if we could just go around the table and introduce yourselves so that we know who you are for the record. Michael?
Okay.
Yeah, it just automatically
It is.
goes.
Okay.
They're very fancy.
I won't touch it.
We'll see how they work.
So Mayor, thanks for having us back.
Our
It's
pleasure.
Good to be with you. I'm Michael O'Hara, the Regional Administrator for the FAA Southern Region.
I'm Chubby Moulton, support Ruth Eastern Service Center.
Bruce Butcher, Council.
George W. Ray Murphy, Town Council.
Council.
Joanne
Council. Joanne, I'm going to turn this over to you now. Do you want to introduce the members of AIR?
Yes, just these are our devoted citizens who represent the entire community for the community's concerns regarding air traffic intrusion into our quality of life. And, Tom Babcock has been on sort of chair of it for a long time, but we have a lot of great members here. I won't take the time to introduce them all. I'll just say thank you for your devotion to the issue on behalf of the community, and I hope that we serve you well here today in the entire community and the FAA, the airport, whatever. This is a combined effort to have a successful airport and good quality of life for everyone here in Southwest Florida. So I guess I'll just go first. Just quickly, I gave you a handout, and it goes with what is up there. Basically, our data since October of 2019 shows no statistical improvement in the back bay utilization or elevation of aircraft. Complaints from the islanders has increased, and a lot of it, or often it is directed to early morning flights. They are exceptionally disruptive, beginning at 5 a.m. Maybe some people hear them earlier. So if you see, when we look at it, then what happens is the use of the back bay has helped a lot over a period of time, but we're still at 47.2% of aircraft are arriving on runway 6, fly over the beach, greater than 100 aircraft a day over our islands, so in peak season. So it has a large impact. And of course, our requests continue to be the increased utilization of the back bay approaches to runway 6 and changing the approach patterns for runway 6 to be like runway 24, and that's those earlier releases. And then requiring all aircraft to fly above 3,000 feet over Estero Island, whether they're flying under VFR or IFR conditions. Right now, 40% of FMB overflights are less than 3,000 feet. That's 40 aircraft a day during peak season under 3,000 feet, and 14.3% are coming at less than 2,000 feet. That's 13 aircraft a day coming at less than 2,000 feet. That is exceptionally disruptive to quality of life. So we are continuing to request training of ATC and pilots and making the runway 06 RNAV and ILS approach plates the same at 3,000 feet. And once again, we continue with runway 24, being the preferred runway from 10 p.m. to 7 a.m., which is the FAA defined nighttime. It's clearly not preferred at night right now, as was recommended by the Part 150 study. 73% of the nighttime arrivals fly over FMB when Miami is in control, versus only 36% when RSW is in control. And so we continue to request the training of pilots to request runway 24 when possible, training RSW, ATC, and Miami control to recommend runway 24 whenever possible, and to direct aircraft over the back bay when using our runway 6, making runway 24 the preferred runway from 10 p.m. to 7 a.m., and making RSW, ATC in control from 5 a.m. to 1 a.m., and Miami Center in control from 1 a.m. to 5 a.m. And that's, RSW just does a better job of control. So we thank you for that, but that's what we're seeking. So when you look at a 7-year, this is just newly done. at a 7-year, you can see the arrivals on runway 6 over the island were at 73.9%, our average of that, 73.9% prior to October 2017. So in October 2017, changes were made and it dropped to an average of 47.2%. That was a great improvement. And we would love to hear specifically how that process was done, what specifically transpired at that point that created that improvement. It may be a building block for improvements moving forward. So I'll be asking that question at the end. And then the percent of Fort Myers Beach overflights lower than 3,000 feet, this is the bad news. You can see that over a period of time, beginning in October 2017, it went from an average of 31% to actually worse. It increased to 40% were lower than 3,000 feet. And then percent lower than 2,000 feet, dramatic over 2017. So we were averaging 4.8. And all flights below 3,000 feet are disruptive, but ones lower than 2,000 feet are exceptionally so. So some of our questions, we didn't do plots on the nighttime because the data clearly shows that runway 24 is not preferred at night, and the performance is much poorer when Miami Air Traffic Control is in control. So I guess some of the questions we have, obviously, we're looking forward to your response, Mike. We know you're working hard on this. We have your ear, and it's greatly appreciated. The same with the folks at RSW, ATC, Lee County Port Authority. But we're pleased that there was a meeting in January 29th of 2020 with the staff and the control tower, and according to Tyler Brown, and they were that the Port Authority had observed improvements, and they were trying to get the planes to stay elevated higher. We're sorry to hear that there really hasn't been much contact with the Miami control tower, that there have been delays, season, busy times, things that happen, but that's particularly discouraging because those nighttime flights so impact our quality of life on the island. So I guess a couple of questions that we have moving forward, obviously, is continuing, how do we keep moving forward in improving our processes? What can we learn from whatever transpired in 2017 and really shed light? What was the directive in October of 2017 that created the improvement in terms of the overflights, but unfortunately a degradation of the altitude? And what can we do moving forward? So that's it for me, sir. I think, Mr. O'Hara, you were going to be kind enough to go next, or Chubby, whomever wants.
My pen is dry. Joanne, as always, I appreciate the preparation and the, if I could call it partnership. I mean, these conversations that have taken place, frankly, prior to my time in the role, as well as last May and October, are informative for our team. They help us identify where some of the pain points are that really you can't tell unless you have these types of engagements. As always, you all are prepared, perhaps more so than I think I can say just about anywhere that I visit, in terms of in terms of data, concerns, and questions, time frames, because really we can look at things, but when you kind of put a finger on a date or say, help us understand, many times we have an answer. I want to take all of Chubby's time, so what I'll probably do is just offer a couple remarks and let him go through some materials, and then I'll probably chime back in, because you had a good bit of topics and a little bit of data that we hadn't seen before today, but it's consistent with the past discussions we've had. There are a lot of dynamics in a system like aviation. We've pulled some data, and sometimes the perspective on growth in air traffic is different.
I think, sir. Pardon me.
But for example, the commercial traffic numbers are up at Fort Myers, and sometimes that you might think, well, that's a linear type growth, or as the airport goes, so goes the flight, so to speak. But a lot of times there's complexity in the merging of that traffic, so it's not unique to here. The growth is not unique to Fort Myers. We're actually seeing it kind of system-wide, but it does create additional pressure on our system. Think of how does the aircraft merge, and we've talked about that before, but just to touch on that. So you have traffic from the north merging with traffic from the south, and as there are fewer gaps, it tends to take away those opportunities to shortcut, bypass the island, I think I could say in a way that makes sense to you all. You have fewer of those opportunities. That doesn't mean hope is gone. What it means is there are a lot of short-term things that we look at, and you've touched on those, and we'll go through those in Chubby's brief. But there are also some longer-term efforts that we are mindful of and opportunities that we realize are, I feel like some of this is a continued dialogue. So there's some opportunities that we have, some tools that we have that haven't made it as far in our system probably as we wish. We talk a lot about satellite navigation, the flexibilities that gives us, some of the environmental challenges, and I'm right in the middle of one of your slides, so I'll quit going too deep. But but at the same time, there are equipage challenges that we have. Who's using the system? So one thing I think that at least I hope everybody appreciates is that we don't want to come in and say magic's going to happen on April 1st, because in reality, there are some longer-term efforts. What we need to do is continue the awareness and continue the effort. I will tell you that we've made some progress on the outreach. I think maybe even more than you've heard with the Miami Center. So again, Chubby's going to talk a little bit about that. But there's some differences in how night operations work. And we've had a good bit of discussion and so sometimes that's where our solutions come from, are the dialogue that we have. What can we do? What are the options? And I do want to assure you those conversations are taking place. So we'll kind of circle through some of that. I think we've discussed it before. There was actually a meeting a couple years ago, Joe, that you probably were here, but I know there's been conversation in the past about the fact that there's an ILS approach on runway 6. There's traffic that comes into Fort Myers from the west. There are winds that often set up a prevailing situation. That's not unique to Fort Myers, but there are a number of factors that make runway 6 attractive. And if nothing else than a pilot having the reassurance that I have my instruments tuned in on that ILS. And I know there's probably a follow-up question from that, but 2-4 does not have that ILS. There also are differences in how the local facility controls airspace versus the en route environment when we roll over to Miami Center. So there's some different separation standards, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong, Joe. I don't think that they manage exactly the same. So it's not a matter of why don't they here? It's just a little different than that. So I'm going to reserve some additional comments, but I kind of wanted to tee off with appreciation and hopefully some sense of assurance that we do some work in between. It hasn't been that long since we were here in late October. I think that there was a request because of elections and turnover, and we certainly wanted to respect that. And I don't want to say we can't do anything in 3.5 months, but I'm not stunned that we don't have magical answers. So let's walk through some of the material and give some updates on material that we've shared in the past, and then I have some other comments that I'd like to mention. I hope he doesn't mind, but Tyler Brown from the airport, from Lee County, is with us, and Tyler's been with us in the past, but I just want to acknowledge that we do have.
Tyler, would you like to come sit at the table? Sit next to Mr. Murphy. He's very nice.
That we do have Tyler here.
Great.
You good, Joey? Okay.
You ready? Okay. Again, thanks everyone. It's kind of the format for the presentation. We met the first time that I've been involved with this project back in May. Came down and we listened to the initial discussion That was just part of an ongoing discussion from previous regional administrators. And based on that initial meeting, then we came back in October to kind of see if we had a better picture of what was some of the concerns, and then looking at data to kind of get an idea of ways that we could actually make a positive change if possible. Just the meeting we've had since then, we've kind of divided into, like I said, we talked about the previous efforts and then recommendations on the evaluations. And then I'm going to kind of go into change consideration and the IFP, instrument flight procedure process, and then we'll just do some Q&A. The first part, we talked about just previous efforts, and this is more of from just the archive history of the project. They developed the back, and some of this is for people who've been here at a couple meetings. This is a repeat, so I won't delve too much into it unless it has a particular. Am I okay picking up?
Yep.
Okay.
You sure are.
We talked about the ILS initial approach altitude was raised to 3,000 feet. That was an effort. Runway 24, there's a lot of discussion about that. That's made the preferred runway during the midnight operation. And remember, it's to preferred, but if it's not the active runway and it's not favorable to the wind, that's just that it's preferred. So that's the one piece I would like to mention on that. So when we looked at that preferred runway, we looked in where was that published. And so we looked in, it is published in the appropriate chart supplement, so it's available to the pilots. It's there for anyone that's going to be coming into the airport, and it speaks of runway 24 to preferred during the nighttime operation. It also talks about aircraft should maintain 3,000 to the shoreline. So there's information out there for the flying public to look at when they're coming into Regional Southwest. It's also listed on the Lee County Port Authority website, and we thought that was important just to see the different venues that it's actually broadcast. So, and then we looked at evaluate to move the initial approach fix for the approaches closest to the airport. That's just, just an overall scoping of the procedures. Was there anything we can do to change the flow into the airport? And there was an attempt to expand the usability of the RNAP approach to runway 6 certified to all equipped aircraft at the Back Bay Visual. Continue. I'm sorry.
I know you like. If you don't mind, right in the middle of the slide, be a nomenclature piece, but I think the way that, if we use the word preferred in a sentence, the way that you used it, Joanne, is it's not the preferred runway. And I think what you're saying is we don't see evidence that anybody prefers to use it. What Chubby's saying is it's designated as a preferred runway. In terms of the realm of what can we do, the air traffic controllers don't normally, going to use the wrong word, but they don't normally pedal a runway. They're not going to, but we have had discussions jointly with the airport about meeting. Some of this is like our controllers. They have recurring training, but in meetings with chief pilots of the carriers that come in, the industry has those types of meetings, and those are opportunities that I think Lee County has taken advantage of, but we've reiterated that that's a good conversation to have. On the one hand, you hope to get the word out. On the other hand, perhaps you get some feedback about why not, and then that tells us something. I think we know some of the reasons why. I think we know, and I alluded to them. I mean, there are reasons why a pilot would choose runway 6 and say, I know 24 is preferred, but the conditions on this flight, I want to use 6. Thank you very much, and that's their provision. But I know I drug that out into a paragraph, but it's a complicated topic, and I think what we're trying to look at is understanding what preferred means, that it's not a mandate, and how can we communicate it, and how can we get folks on board. So those types of conversations are happening. Is that fair?
Yes, runway set on wind. So if the wind's favoring runway 6, we use runway. When it becomes an option is when the wind is low enough that we can use runway. Take into account where the aircraft are coming from, their operational needs and necessities. And our guys say runway 24 is the preferred runway. The pilot comes over and says operational necessity runway. because they need that for an operational purpose for safety for some. So you have to take into effect that, okay, what's the winds doing that night? Runway 6, that's up to 15, 20 knots. There's no way we're using 2-4. It's try and land 2-4 when the preferred runway is runway 6. And if we have a night where the winds are calm and it's runway, the controllers will tell them preferred runway, and that's up to the pilot to decide if his safety is better on 6 or better on 2-4. Tell us runway 6. Our hands are tied after that. And I appreciate the fact that RSW, you guys have the perception that RSW does a better job than Miami Center. Lucky with the numbers, I think, because Miami Center is trained and refreshed as much as we are. So they get the same training we do, we get the same training they do. They're refreshed. I've had conversations with that air traffic manager, a lot of the OM's operational managers refresh their training. So they do. So I think they do an outstanding job of trying to get the preferred runway to 2-4 available in the pilots.
I know we're in the middle of Chubby's presentation, but maybe we can get back to at the end, and if it's hard to get onto 6 rather than 2-4 at night, or 2-4 at night rather than 6, then how about elevation? That makes a huge difference, especially at night. So maybe we can get back to that.
That's good.
Sorry,
And thank you, Chubby.
And one of another piece of the controller will not assign the runway. So when the tower is TRACON, they're going to use and have an active runway. When it goes to the center, they're just going to clear the aircraft 40 feet, and they're going to, so that adds another layer in there where the controller at Miami is not going to say to a particular runway. So that's the other part on that part. So that's part of the, more of the outreach, getting aircrafts and getting the controllers on the same page. So previous effort we did, like I said before, we looked at the historical flight track data for trends, and that was just part of the initial scoping. We talked about the SOP, we reviewed the air traffic standard operating procedures for opportunities for improvement, and we evaluated the forward runway use program for effectiveness. And that was just part of seeing if it's utilized to the extent, or was there any way that maybe we could broadcast it, or anything that we could do to make it, where everybody was on the same page. And we reviewed the RSW operation, where we looked at the, when TRACON had the airspace and when Miami. Also, we validated the systematic noise abatement training, and that's what we found where RSW was having degree, but what they were able to do with the discussion, they actually incorporated that training where it's being conducted yearly now. Before, I think it was sporadic, so they've actually incorporated in their refresher training. So it's actually once a year the controllers are brought into a briefing and they're understand that probably, like I said, it's going to take a while, but that's going to be part of the normal discussion. So hopefully we will see some value with that training, and that's an awareness piece. What we're doing now, evaluating, we got some data a little bit later on. Just some of the things we were able to kind of compare data from our previous discussion time frame, and then since we've also, we're looking at both sides of noise abatement, supplement, websites, pilot forums, anything that pilots are coming into, so that everybody's aware. Not only that runway 24 is the preferred runway, for the piece about maintain 3,000 until the shoreline. So that's the piece that we're really trying to get out to the pilots, because as a controller on the midshift, they're going to clear the aircraft for an approach. They're not normally going to say maintain 3,000 into the shoreline. That's going to be something that if the pilot is aware of it, to the extent practical, they will maintain 3,000. So that's the piece that we want to get out to the pilots, because that's not going to be something that's going to be normally in the controller's, toolkit. It's going to be something of an altitude for separation or procedures, but when you tell that, that's a little bit added verbiage for the pilots. And also part of we determined interest in procedure. Last time we talked about the RNAV global position of GPS procedures, RMP procedures, and then also other instrument procedures. One caveat on that, just remember, any changes to flight plan is subject. Long story short on that, there's gonna be a time involved, and there's gonna be community outreach, there's gonna be discussions, and there's gonna be a chance for an opportunity for everybody to kind of get their on any changes. So what we did was, when we left last time, we were looking, a lot of discussions were around runway 6, what aircraft were going in on runway 6. But what we tried to do, look at just overall aircraft, runway 6, whether over the beach, inline the bay. And so we went in, we pulled a couple time frames. We pulled July, September of 18, and we have just to kind of get an overall trend thing that stood out based on just, just initial scoping. So what you can see is that, and this is just numbers for the runway 6, so if you throw 24 out, so that's the biggest thing on this. During this time frame, there was a total of a little over 4,000 aircraft that actually utilized runway 6. Of that 4,000, over 1,000 went over the hour. Got 3,000 that are not. So the trend, I think, throughout the data, what we're showing, and there's a chart later on, where we're saying about 30%, looks like, of those numbers, I think 40% are going actually over the hour. I think that's. So what we're trying to do is just look where were the aircraft that are going over the hour. Natural tendency for, you can actually see it kind of varies, or when they're actually extending the base, they're proceeding up. And some that are coming in straight out. Not a whole lot of variance there. That was just kind of evaluate to look for opportunities that we can see if anything stood out from that. We look at this same time frame, went to 19. The one thing we found, and I don't know if there was a downtick for some reason. I'll go up a little bit later on. There was overall a decrease. Quite sure what caused the decrease, but the one thing we did find, the numbers are pretty much the same when it comes to the percentage that are going over the outlet and inlet. So the numbers kind of came up the same. We go forth to a big, larger time, and this is kind of what we were looking at based on our previous discussion. So we tried to find out, this is more of a peak period. Try to see if we went back to last year prior to our initial discussion, could we find any variance? Also, like I say, it's just tracks over the island and inside, because when we tried to pull the numbers for altitude, we were getting various altitudes. I guess for that. What we were finding when we tried to find the altitude over the island per se, the piece that we were having a little difficulty is after the aircraft are coming, let's say they're on the downwind turning bays, over the island for so many miles. When we tried to pull the data, what point were we using as the reference point? That was the difficulty with trying to find an overall altitude. But I will say that we did find where aircraft were lower. So it was just, the altitude was varied. We didn't see an uptick with the altitude overall. I'll let you know on that part of that discussion. This is for 2018, the January timeframe. As you can see, a little over 7,700 tracks for runway 6, and of that, over the island was roughly about 2,100, a little over 20. Still within that 40%. That seems the same throughout. And here we're talking from November of 2019. January of 2020, January. And it's the same thing. What we saw now that the traffic has gone up, there are going to be more aircraft because of volume. So as volume goes up, there are going to be more tracks that are going to be extended. And from this picture, you see where a lot more, they're turning them downwind to base, making sure they have the appropriate space. And so you're going to see line and everything. So, but there's still quite a few of that 3,000 are over the island, and then you got roughly 6,100 that are not over the island. Within that. And then these are the numbers we were talking about. If you look at that, like I said, the one on the left, that's just overall numbers of the operation you see where we talked about in 2018. There was a 500 million. If you come to that same time frame, slight decrease. But if you go to that same time frame in November 2019 and in 2019 to 20, you see whether there's an increase, which is normal. There's going to be an increase. I think we've kind of mentioned that earlier. So all the numbers show that there have been an increase. Look to the chart down to that is for runway 6 arrivals, and that's what we got for numbers. These are arrivals that are to runway 6 over the island with the total number, and that's roughly 26. What from the lowest point, I guess, was 22 at the highest point we're showing, which is pretty much in line with what our data. I think a little bit maybe lower than some of the, but that may have to do with the fact that you're choosing a point over the island. I think that's a big discrepancy in the numbers. I think that's probably why that number is down just a little bit on that part. This is just what we're talking about the current airport. And part of the reason this is talk about what can we do but we have to look what's currently available. I think part of the thing you talked about was the awareness for the controllers. I think we've had those discussions. We begin to talk to RSW, we begin to talk to Miami, and they're putting things in place. They have things in place for training the controllers. We talked about the back bay visual, and I think some of our numbers indicated there was slight of aircraft that were actually flying inside the bay based on some of the numbers from previous, although not a whole lot, just a slight. So on that point, so this is just the procedures that are at the airport now. Going forth, like I said, I don't think we're looking to put in different any runway 24, but there may be an opportunity to where we can look at the runway 6 and maybe some of the altitude, some of the procedures. We did have an initial conversation on that, and I will apologize in advance. We were trying to get some more definite information on that. But what we were initially advised by the flight procedures team, there may be an opportunity for runway 6 on the outlet that we can actually move the initial approach fix perhaps a little bit farther out, raise the altitude. The end result would be a higher altitude when they cross the beach. Now that's considering they're actually on the procedure. So that's the one thing to be aware of. A lot of times the aircraft may line up for the procedure, and then if they're cleared for the visual, the altitudes may be a little bit different. So I will mention that while we're going through this, but we don't have a definite answer on that. Something to just kind of, be aware of.
The VOR, DME, and TACAN, could you explain that? We haven't really discussed that directly before, I don't think.
Actually, what they're going to use the County VR as a navigational tool, and that's going to be to runway 24. That doesn't offer, I don't think it will offer you that much because of just with the weather. I think the standards on the VR is going to be a little bit different on the procedures for actually flying that procedure. So, and I don't think that's being utilized a whole lot. I don't know if that's going to, that would be something more with the local air traffic controller if they're utilizing that procedure. My understanding, the bulk of the aircraft are doing the ILS or the maybe RNAP GPS.
Correct.
Yeah. Hopefully that answers
It did,
part of
thank
the
you.
question. So, and then there's like I said, go back to the previous discussion. Talk about the RNAP GPS and OMP. Just a kind of reduced list of does develop a transition for aircraft over the vein, avoiding the beach area. So our altitude, that's a new way. Greater navigation. Talked about that now. Those procedures you're talking more of what we talked about, the rope. Everybody's gonna be on that line, so you're gonna get aircraft concentrated in a little bit more defined area. So, in a sense, for the control predictability, sometime with the community, maybe not so much. Aircraft operating at idle speed, and the part of that, hopefully, the configuration of the aircraft would hopefully, idle speed would be maybe, the hope is lower noise, not guaranteed, but that would be the hope, smoother flight path. And the 2% flight path throughout. So some of the challenges, people, environmental noise screening, separation requirements are a little bit different between the secret requirement for the different. So may not be able to use the RMP for periods of high traffic, so you may have to go back to more conventional. In that case, they would go back to a little bit more vectoring. Fleet mix, and they looked at that, and I think it supports it for the most part of the fleets that come in. But training, there's added training for pilots and for the cost benefits. Validation according with the time frame. We're looking at the procedure. Does it make sense for the airport? Will it be supported? There's an implementation investment and time frame, and also there's going to be future maintenance for the procedures. And these are just a list of the change consideration, environmental concerns, airspace. We talked about the surrounding airports, and then you have to be aware of that. Proximity to the beach, because there's going to be that. Airport configuration, single runway, and then there's going to be where pilots get involved with the concern of the, know what's initially submitted, there may be changes to in order to be outreach. Air traffic control operational requirements. Like I said, because the main is the separation of aircraft. You have to keep in mind. And one of the things, a lot of discussion, there's been an increase on that last bullet where the significant amount of visual VFR aircraft not in communication. Where that plays a role is that first part, they're not, I'm sorry, the latter part where they're not in communication. That's something we also had to be very aware of, you know. I would guess this time of year there's probably maybe an increase with the weather being nice and VFR going out. I think the people come down from different areas to enjoy the beach. Probably that's the same thing for some.
I don't understand that. When you say the visual flight rules, talking about a Delta pilot? I
We're
didn't
talking
think so.
about a private pilot
Right.
who's just jumping in their aircraft, going out, they're just
Right,
enjoying
right.
the view, and they're
But-
gonna be
but they're
flying
not the
around
ones
along the
making
beaches.
noise.
Yeah. That's part, like I said, part of that is just change consideration. We have to be aware of that component when we're making. And this is part of the process that we go through when we're looking at a change to any procedure or introducing possibility of amending. And like I said, it won't go too much in the top part of it. There's already a request put in the gateway. So I'll kind of start on the third bullet. The team have to actually go through and analyze and request and determine the response. And that's part of the process where they have to look at it, the availability of the airport. Will it support the airport? Is there a need for that procedure? And that would be done at the flight procedure. They go through the bar procedure where they, if it's approved for the airport, and they want to make sure that it can be airspace. So if it's not supported, there's not going to be a lot of use, then that's going to be weighed in when they're looking at any changes to procedure. If the request is not approved by the instrument flight procedure team, it will be documented. And that's the caveat that, you know, if that procedure, for some reason, they determine, they would document it. Also, they have to prioritize, evaluate the request and determine the production schedule. And basically, that's when they try to figure out when, if they do decide to proceed forth with the procedure when the schedule would allow them to actually come in, put it on their schedule. As part of that,
Chubby, if I could jump in.
Yep.
You'll notice the word nationals there. Some of the folks on our team cover the East Coast. Recall in my title, it says regional, so I'm kind of southeast, but there is a national process. You know, in one of our prior meetings, there was a request for an update on the Metroplex, and I don't want to go deep for the Metroplex, but it plays in here because some folks may remember that was a huge scope. As originally envisioned, our Metroplex project was going to modernize airspace, all of Central and South Florida. I think we've talked about that in the past, but because of budget restrictions and timelines and expiring funds, we were facing as an agency a position where if we didn't meet a deadline and the money goes away, then none of the project occurs. So it was down scoped, and that's just kind of the way it occurred. So we focused on what's unique in Florida among all 50 states is the fact that we have 4 major international hubs. We call them Core 30 airports. That redesign's focused on from Tampa to Orlando to Fort Lauderdale and Miami, and it doesn't include this part of Southwest Florida. The agency's still committed to satellite navigation, but that's a pretty rigorous schedule that involves all of the environmental outreach and design that Chubby's mentioned that we're doing actively last year and this year. Trying to go too deep in that because I know it's not here, but at the same time it's nearby. I think part of the question was, is that going to affect flights over this part of the world? I can tell you comfortably, by my definition, no. There are flights that go inbound into Southeast Florida that travel over this area, 28,000 feet, I think. And that will not change. In fact, if anything, they could be more efficient flights. Our hope is obviously to expand that, and there are other processes to do that. But we'll be working this summer through that environmental process, spring and summer, with the public and through that environmental process to implement procedures I mentioned, more than 100 procedures in other parts of Florida in 2 different charting dates in 2020. The reason I'm telling you all that is partly because you said, keep us in the loop on Metroplex. But the other part is when we talk about making changes in this neck of the woods or looking at procedures and talk about national priorities, this may not be the most popular news, and it doesn't mean that we're not even today having conversations with senior leadership. They understand there's a need to focus on Fort Myers and look at what we can do here. We've already taken a lot of our time in 2021, and when you talk about training controllers and procedures, just really transparent. We have some work ahead of us kind of in the queue that Chubby's mentioning. So even if everybody in the room said unanimous across the whole region of Fort Myers, the 18 months doesn't start today. It might start a period of months from now when we kind of come up for air from that other. So I just want to give that context, and I'm happy to answer questions. Sometimes, in fact, I think last time we were here, people were like, we love it, when can we do it? That I'm exaggerating a little bit, but
That doesn't happen.
our world is complicated and your world is complicated, and then when we think we're solving yesterday's problem next year, something else has changed in the world. So that's just part of what we deal with. That's why the conversations are helpful. And I hope through all that you hear that we're committed and we're tracking. We want to find the right path and the right solution. But as is often the case, it's not tomorrow. And I felt like that was a good time to throw that in. So Chubby, thank you for letting me interrupt again.
that's good that I want to kind of echo, like I said, we talked about the 18 and 24 month, but that's from the approval when it gets. And then we're to just question and comment. One last thing I would mention, just going back to some of the previous data when we were looking at the trends, we tried to find areas where there was improvement, and we tried to find areas where, you know, gotten worse. So one area where we were able to find just a slight improvement based on the time frame that we're in now. When we looked at the numbers from November of 2019 through January of 2020, The initial numbers indicated there was an increase of roughly almost 7% traffic over last year, that time frame when we looked at it. Of that, where we showed that the increased number of traffic, the tracks that actually went over the beach, there was a slight reduction. So there was one positive piece out of that. So there, I know it's not at the level that you would like. That's, I don't know if maybe that's part of this discussion, maybe it's part of having a discussion with the controllers at the tower, Tracon, or at Miami Center. I know a lot of that focus was at the center, and that's where the biggest number of the improvement was during the midnight operation at Miami Center. So I did want to add that piece, part of the discussion. So we did find where there was some slight improvement in that area. And part of that could be the fact that we've only had a few months of this. We had these discussions back in August, September timeframe with the Miami controllers, where it was put into their briefing, refresher training. We've gone through one cycle of that training. So that's just one area we did see a slight improvement on the number.
Before we go to questions, there may be some specific follow-ups. Just a couple of quick sentence updates. I mentioned the ILS exists to runway 6. Pilots typically aren't going to think of that as backup. I don't know what a good car analogy is. We often look for those, but you might have a lot of tools in your car. You have a speedometer, but maybe you're checking your speed on the GPS as well. There's a comfort level when you're flying a passenger airliner, and everything looks good out the window, but I'm still going to look at my instruments. So it's not uncommon, even when you have a visual flight, that a pilot would utilize the signal that's there on 6 that doesn't exist on 2-4. And the only way they acquire that signal is typically they're going to be below. So again, this may be things you've heard before, it may not be, but you don't acquire that radio signal, if you will, from above. You typically are going to fly until you say, all right, now I've got it. So there's just some challenges that exist in terms of how the system's designed, if you will. That was not one sentence. The runway center line, when you look at the island, and you almost can't see on, I kind of call it a spaghetti chart, but all the tracks, it's hard to even tell other than, yep, there are a lot of planes. But you all probably in the room could validate, there may be nodding heads when I say this, but it does appear that there's more concentration toward the center of the island, which is the center of the runway extended. But there are a lot of turns. I mean, some of the turns are almost on the back of the northeast corner of the island, for example. So when you count everything that goes over the island, they're not all lined up from the Gulf straight over the same condos, houses, and apartments. And one other thing that I think we may want to keep in mind, I may need to keep in mind, because I learn when we have conversations, but I think when we talk about the 2-4 versus the runway 6 in the longer term, as I said, we're committed to satellite navigation. It's the future of aviation. We will be there. What that means and how we disperse flights is the subject of many discussions, and how we utilize that technology to be as good a neighbor as we can be is something literally being discussed on a daily, weekly, monthly basis across the country. But when we think about making 2-4 as attractive as possible, we want to make sure that the pilot who's making that decision has as efficient a route to 2-4. So a lot of what we've talked about, not all of it, but a lot of what we've talked about is satellite approaches to 6, because the demand's there and it can help with the altitudes, maybe reduce power, cleaner aircraft we talked about last. We also want to make sure pilots don't lose too much by making. I'm saying that here, I try to not surprise our team, but that's something that I want to make sure we keep in mind, that we don't make 6 more attractive, if that makes sense.
Yes.
So just a couple of points that came up. Chubby, you did a great job going through. So let's see what we've sparked.
Well, first of all, what you spark in me is how much we appreciate the time that you've put into this conversation. We talked about it being a partnership, and I can say frankly, I haven't been in it as long as some of these other individuals on the island. but it didn't always feel like a partnership, and I think it's feeling more like a partnership, I would have to say. You used the word transparent twice, and I think that it does feel like you're making an effort just to have an open, honest conversation with us about the reality of running an airport with this much traffic and safety being always the primary concern, and we recognize that. So I really want to appreciate, to let you know how much we appreciate that. It's just very impressive, Chubby, your effort and your support and your being here. Just the fact that you sped up the meeting to come and get this one in, and we'll make plans for when our next meeting should be and see how that fits in with the timeframes that you talk about. But it just shows your absolute desire to be in a partnership conversation with us. Particularly appreciated because, in all honesty, when the railroad came over us, we weren't consulted. And so moving forward, as the airline industry changes, as FAA changes and goes to GPS and updates, we want to be there in the conversation this time. We should be in the conversation, and I know you're going to keep us in that conversation. So I think that those are really critical things. Also, we recognize that 06, for a lot of reasons, is attractive, and we happen to sit at the end of it. That's where you built RSW, okay? And we won't get into why or what, but it happens. And the points you make about 24, but all of those things highlight again its elevation, because those of us who sit, no matter where we are, it is scattered more over the island. There's less over the island and more over the back bay. We appreciate that, but it's altitude, and I know you've showed us why it takes a while to get them elevated, but any short-term compared to long-term things we can do about elevation makes a huge difference. Because we all know when we're outdoors, this is an outdoor community. When we are outdoors and that plane is low, hugely different than when they're high. When they're high, it's not so bad. But when they're coming in 2,000 feet and below, you know that you got a plane coming in, shaking your party and everything else. So I guess I turn it to you. I guess I would like to just ask if there's a quick question, and please make it polite and brief.
We'll definitely
So,
make it,
step
yes,
here.
we'll definitely make it polite and brief. If you could bring up slide 6.
On his or mine?
On his,
On
either 6,
Chubby?
7, or 8.
Let's see.
And while you're
I'm
doing
gonna
that, I'll
go
just
all the way
talk
back.
about background.
What was it
I'm Bob
about?
Connor. I live here on the island. I manage large, what's that?
Okay, so,
Charles Connor. I manage large projects on behalf of the Department of Energy and the Department of Defense. And this is large design and construction projects, so I know what it's like to get a group of 500 engineers all pointed in the same direction and to try and get something built. One thing I find with large groups of engineers is something similar to what I see happening here. A contingent of those engineers will wait until we can solve absolutely every problem before we'll start the first one. And the fact is, you can solve 90% of this problem with just a few simple actions, which don't require any new laws, which don't require any new regulations, which don't require a lot of FAA effort.
is this the
Just-
correct slide?
Pardon me?
Is this the correct?
This is the slide I'm looking for. Just a little background on coming in. You see that mark called Tropic? That's the initial approach fix on ILS 06. And when you approach that, air traffic control will say, November 8 to Lima Lima, cross tropic at or above 3,000 feet. He has to say that, the crossing altitude. Cross tropic at or above 3,000 feet. Cleared for the ILS 6 approach, RSW. And that's the way he will do it. It takes no more time to say 3,000 feet than it does to clear somebody for that approach. If they're coming in on an instrument approach, which 90% of your commercial airlines are going to do, they're not going to come in here on a visual. They've got passengers in the back. They'll come in and they'll shoot an approach. We talked about Part 91 aircraft, the guy who's just going up flying. Well, these folks aren't complaining about 172s flying over the island. They're talking about 737s and above who are flying below altitude over the island, 2,000 feet, and dragging it in on the engines, and we all know what that is. When you drag one in on the engines, you can hear it because it's gotten too low and too slow. He's got his flaps down, He's in a landing configuration almost. He hadn't dropped his gear yet, but it takes a whole lot of power now to keep him in the air. Whereas if he shoots an ILS, all he has to do is chop and drop, and he's idling when he goes over the island. Every pilot knows that. Chop and drop. Well, that's what they call it. If you'll look here, these green, that's called what the freight dogs do. They'll say, turn me in tight. I want to get to the airport. I want to get this over with. You don't need to do that. The fact is, you're coming to an airport, a large airport. If it takes 30 seconds more to get to touchdown, that doesn't matter. And they stack them up miles out. The one who stacks them up is approach. They'll come in from center. They'll be turned over to approach, Fort Myers approach, and Fort Myers approach will stagger them in so that they land the way they should. And when he does, they're coming in from the north, the south, the west. They should be flying them over traffic and clearing them just like that. They have to fly over traffic at 3,000 feet. If they're on 3,000 feet and pulling their engines back to idle and dropping their flaps, by the way, they call it gear down, go down. That's how you land. When you pass that fix, that's when you drop your gear. It's like putting your brakes on, and it will glide a 3-degree glide slope all the way to the airport. Now, if they do that, they're almost on idle, and they'll be pulling a line right through here, not making much noise at all. That's already on the books. They don't have to train anybody. All they have to do is put a sign up over where the folks sit and say, when you turn over, the agreement between us and the airport is we'll turn over at tropic and we'll make them cross at 3,000. There's those agreements all over the state of Florida. They're all over the U.S. In fact, if you fly into Teterboro, New York, if you're flying in instrument or you're flying in Part 91, you better fly in over the fixes they tell you to, and you better fly in over the proper altitudes, or they'll pull your license when you touch down. So, it's real easy. The rules are on the books. You bring them in over tropic, you're going to cross right there. All of this will go away. You'll solve 90% of your problem, and pardon me, that cost me $5 in my meeting.
So we make you sing sometimes.
Good. So, but if you'll do that, it won't take you any new rules. You'll solve 90% of the problem. People would prefer you use 2-4 at night, but if you bring them all over the island at 3,000 feet, coming in from tropic with their engine set for going down, it will solve 90% of the problem that you have now, and then next time you get together, you can work on taking the next step. Do the 90% fix today, do the 10% fix tomorrow.
Thank you, sir.
You bet.
Tom?
I'm sorry, before Tom speaks, I worked with this group before,
Yeah.
and what people were advocating before is to eliminate the railroad track. That sounds like it brings back the railroad track, that everybody's flying over the same houses. I understand that, but if it's the same houses getting it all the time, I can tell you that I've had lots of positive comments from folks all over the island that they're coming in different places now and they prefer that. So that would be my only response to what you said.
Right now, I've seen them fly low altitudes all over the island.
And I agree, I want it to be higher altitude, but I don't want it to be a railroad track.
Unless they have a control to fix that they have to cross at 3,000.
Tom, do you have a question?
I need to get to know you.
You bet. Nice to meet you.
Shouldn't we get their response to
Yes, I think that would be great. Is there any immediate response, or you just prefer to take this in right now?
Joe, do you have any thoughts?
There's a lot of factors that go into that, and it's the second time I've heard the VFR aircraft aren't causing noises for you guys. The air carriers are the big problem. Well, the problem is VFR aircraft are flying over the island or by the island, near the island at 3,000, 3,500, whatever altitude they want to, because they're not in our control. The problem with that is we've got an air carrier at 3,000, a VFR at 3,000. Someone's going to descend, and if we're not talking to this guy's going to descend. We have to get that for safety reasons. So VFR there is a factor of the VFR aircraft out there flying around uncontrolled airspace. We have to avoid those aircraft for safety. So that affects the altitude. Weather affects the altitude. If it's IFR, storms are out, the air carriers want to fly lower, grab the ILS sooner out and be prepared for landing. As far as the noise is concerned, when they're dropping their gear, all the air carriers have different things, and the port has actually met with the air carriers and talked about, you know, keeping cleaner over the island and all that. Well, their operational necessity requires them, some air carriers, to drop their gear sooner than others. So there are some air carriers that keep the landing gear up till past the island or closer to the airport, but there are some that drop them. That's their requirements. That's their requirements.
Is there a process for us, that could be put in place that would control VF aircraft through a certain strip of this airspace that would
Well, we're
improve
actually
that for
starting to
you?
look at pushing our, it's called the Charlie airspace, out farther. We're looking at it as a safety issue. We have these aircraft flying out that are non-controlled, and when we do have the availability to talk to them, we explain it to them, and some are very acceptable for what we're
Like
saying.
a lot from Naples Airport, not to pick on Naples,
It's
but,
everywhere.
it's
They
everywhere.
come from everywhere, flight schools, and
so
it just
that's
depends.
a possibility of
Yeah,
doing
so we're
that?
trying to push the Charlie out so they cannot go in that airspace unless they, but like they said, it's a process, and it's not going to happen in 60 days or, you know, it's going to be a long process, so.
What is your question? Do you have a question? Okay.
I'd like to respond to the presentation.
Tom, can you turn and face that microphone, please?
Sure.
Now, all of a sudden, everybody feels like they can talk wherever they want to talk.
Will it pick it up?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What you proposed was essentially what happened in 2008. In 2008, they added the shift approach from the south. When they did that, required all the aircraft to come out and go over that GPS point. So between 90 and 100% of that new approach coming right over the center of the island. That's what really started this whole process in 2008. The interesting thing is that Southwest Airlines suggested that they could save millions of dollars if they could go back to what they were originally allowed, which was to turn behind the island. So that's why we've been continuing to work. In fact, it looked like part of that happened in October of 2017. I haven't seen any formal paperwork, but in that month, about the middle of that month, significant increase of aircraft started to go behind the island only on the shifty approach, because the TD approach didn't saw a significant improvement in terms of the number coming over the island. By the way, I'm a data guy. I love your data. I think we're consistent whether our numbers are different or not. I want to point out one other thing.
I was going to say, let's get your... For now, let's get the questions to these gentlemen, who I know he's got another meeting he's going to. Get a question to him.
I have no question. I want to explain
okay.
some of the differences if I could,
Okay.
because I think this data is very telling. The reason why we may have slightly different percentages, the reason why there was a significant shift in the altitude when that change was made in March of 2017. What happened, large density of people south end of this island. Not only were they starting to see more earlier, but not early enough to stay over the back bay, they've already started their approach and they're coming over the island lower. Now, you pointed out one way to fix that is to take it back the way you're saying, farther. Ching, that costs money. The other approach that we're suggesting, go the other way, which is what happens on runway 24. It's a cost savings, quality improvement savings. Quite honestly, it isn't over a higher population of people. In fact, it's less. I'll quit there.
Very Elevate,
Yeah.
elevate.
Are there any other questions? Because with all just due respect to these gentlemen, they need to get to another meeting, and we still have quite a few agenda items to move on. Go ahead, Ray.
I have one question. You can probably answer. I'm ignorant of these matters. Why does RSW pass it back to Miami Center in the evening, overnight?
Right. overnight, and they need.
You can't justify a controller in that tower overnight with the number of craft that are coming in, is that?
Right now, but it's initiated, like I said, by the airport. It's not something the air traffic control is initiated. By the airport, they want a 24-hour facility there. So but right now, we're
Is that
open till
coming?
midnight. So he wouldn't know anything about it, so. But no, I don't
Maybe
think.
that would help, wouldn't it? Having our own people rather than having Miami make the call?
Other questions?
Anybody have the statistics about the wind directions, how much the wind comes from the southeast or the southwest or the
Not
northeast?
solid, but it's about 80% of the time that.
Wind is dictating 80% of the
Correct.
flights, okay.
Correct.
Joanne, anything else?
No, I would say, once again, I'll turn it back maybe to you as a group and say, what do we see of potential short-term things are mostly and long-term as compared to long-term? And what might our target be for a next meeting that's more reasonable in terms of accomplishing something in a short-term or long-term? Not all new people, and some of us may just be over in those chairs.
Joanne and I will be gone.
Yeah, obviously.
No, I won't be. Joanne might.
Joanne might be.
I personally won't.
So that's a good question, and Chubby or Joe, you're welcome to chime in. I think there are some specific things in terms of the outreach we've talked about that are near term. Continuing the effort with controllers. I mean, I will tell you that what happens when we walk out of these meetings are almost a set of minutes. You know, these were some new points, or these are some pain points, if you will, and that kind of drives our discussion coming out. So that will happen. We will follow up. I also know that, without getting into too much FAA structure, everybody doesn't work for me in the region, but I know that in Chubby's senior management chain, they're aware of the priority issue. So I talked about national priorities, and while I don't drive those specifically, I don't govern that process, I guess it's fair to say I have influence, and the conversations and the trips we've had here are on that management radar. So the conversation that I hear, this may be a little too transparent, but I mentioned before, like, slots are full. It's like we can't promise everybody everything at the same time, and our plate is full. But the conversation literally in the last 24 hours didn't stop there. It was, but we'll look for opportunities, and if something opens, even ahead of time. So I think it's safe to say that because of the level of preparedness, because of the points, because of the amount of traffic, there is that awareness. So I put all that in the near term, continued FAA discussion of what can we do. There may be ideas that you all have, and these meetings are a forum for us to glean that. Your data is a avenue or vehicle for us to get that. So that's helpful, particularly if something changes, or if you say something amazingly wonderful happened, or oh my gosh, what did you do? That's helpful for us to have the insight. Longer term, I think we keep the focus on the procedure development, the opportunities that are there. As I said, kind of a new point for me is making sure we don't forget the attractiveness of 2-4. But as Joe said, the winds are something we don't control. One number I didn't mention, and I think it's accurate because we generally keep pretty good statistics. I was on our official data site last night, which is publicly available. I actually did it from home. Call it ATADS. I don't even know what ATADS stands for, but it's probably the air traffic. Anyway, it's our count of traffic. You can pull it up. You can put in filters. It's not a live track tool, but it has counts of operations. And it divides those by the commercial traffic, but also military, air taxi, and general aviation. And over the last 4 years, air taxi, general aviation, and military flights into RSW were showing a decline, but the commercial traffic was up 13.6%. So that's significant in the realm of the conversation. When we're saying we have 100 flights a day. With that kind of growth, that's something that's going to show up on the statistics. But I think keeping in mind those conversations, that opens the door to the airlines that want to be good neighbors, and the conversations that had with the airport about, in fact, I think Chubby even said, can we be a part of that? Is there an opportunity that we can come and get together? So that's a broader part of the industry. So there are some conversations that need to happen. There's some ideas that can come out of it. We've talked about Southwest procedure. Southwest is limited in terms of how much they can fly if they're the only ones flying a particular procedure. So pushing for more acceptance and utilization, that's in that not overnight category. But how do we get more folks taking advantage of that? Controllers at Joe's facility have a realistic shot at safely maintaining a predictable path. And the last point is, when a pilot's flying, I should know, Joe, you could tell me, but when they're flying to the southwest, south of the airport, and they're going to make the turn over the island, they don't know where that turn's going to occur. They may potentially be flying a little lower. And so if they get extended, all that factors into vector, can delay a turn. If unpredictability isn't your friend. It's not the friend of safety, but it's really not the friend of everybody being on the same page and optimizing. I think everything that we're talking about increasing that level of predictability is going to be in that longer term category of improving the situation. Aircraft has the best shot at being where we want, where we don't, avoiding where we don't want, and hopefully being as clean as it can be at that spot.
So if we have some goals of obviously, it's like you say, you don't pedal a runway, let's say, and obviously, the wind does pedal a runway probably a lot where you can't. Certainly, we're looking for you to pedal elevation. That's clear. And it doesn't matter if it's coming over the center of the island or into the back bay. We're looking to pedal increased elevation, altitude. So I'm just wondering if we might make a plan moving forward when we meet next, and you might correspond with us in the interim of ways that you think that we might pedal that, and how long that might take. If it might include, the VFR airspace conversation, and if that's something that can happen and how soon. The IAF over the back bay, if we can get that done, a sooner IAF there, and get that elevation up at least. Just couple specific things as we understand there must be a huge transition beyond our comprehension of the FAA converting into GPS, satellite, and whatever, we all know what it takes to switch our phone for the next iOS. So does that sound like a reasonable basis to you for our next, and how soon should we meet again?
This was too soon.
Yeah. We said it's appreciated.
So that's a possibility.
Okay.
You want to say this time next year, don't you?
When does the traffic not as bad as it was?
Yes.
In the fall.
January 10th. Yeah, you want to be here in the fall. November's great.
I think it took longer to get here from the airport than it did to fly from Atlanta
I'm
to
sure
the
it did.
airport.
We fly blind, we know.
I'm sure it did, yes. So definitely,
For October,
Yeah,
November?
maybe later in the year.
okay.
All right.
And
so
frankly,
let's do that.
I think we can commit to the dialogue and maybe whether it's a phone call or an
say,
email, we've done letters, we've done everything.
Sure.
So frankly, letters start to get a little more formal, but maybe we have a conversation and say, does that still make sense, or does anything earlier make sense? But
And next month, late March, beginning of April, we will contact you and let you know. Right now, you and I are emailing. We'll let you know who the new Joanna is sitting in this seat, the updated model. So, and that'll be a person who will get them well versed and get them going. It might be Rexanne, she's been there before. So maybe we'll do that introduction and then plan on the fall and keep it moving. Does that make sense?
it does.
And I cannot, again, thank you thank you enough for your obvious time and effort put into listening to us and keeping us in the conversation. And that's what we ask, moving forward, that we keep the conversation going. Don't forget us in your redesign. Don't forget us in every thought that you can to get it elevated.
And you know, as much as that traffic was irritating, people complain about the planes just as much. It is, everybody's got their thing. I was just saying at lunch today, on Sunday, Tom, I was gonna call you. There was I guess it was about 2:30, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and this plane came over and it was extraordinarily low. It was really low, and I said, wow, this will be something to bring up, but anyway, thank you.
This was, just for the record, this was photoshopped, though. I just,
This one was, oh, absolutely. That one, yes.
Yes, that was Photoshop, yes.
Yeah, that one's on
But
the
it
way to
wasn't that
Naples.
much different.
That's a VFR on the way to Naples. That's-
Is there anything else from anybody at the table? Chubby?
I just want a clarification on this particular
Yes, sir.
document.
Yes.
I just want to make sure I'm reading, because, when we're looking at data, what we're saying on that one, prior to 2017, you were saying on average, there were roughly 74%.
Yeah.
Now, afterwards, you're saying it's 47. Am I,
Yeah.
is I?
Tom, I've got it,
That's right.
their data, okay, on this particular one.
So there was a reduction.
Yeah, oh, that's what we're saying.
Okay.
We're wondering what
What-
exactly
what
What happened?
Okay.
What happened?
That's why I want to make sure the point is being, okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, and then you can see at the same time, however, the altitude got worse. But it was,
Okay.
there's a temporal moment.
Okay. I just-
Thank you.
okay.
I can answer that right now.
Joe, go ahead.
Wait, got an answer.
So, my management team came in 2015. Whenever I come into a new facility, I look at the operation, see how we could safely move aircraft. And community involvement's definitely part of, not community involvement, but how it affects the community is definitely a concern of ours. So, 2015, I was wondering why we're not using the back bay. And through research and all that stuff, we changed the approaches to where we're using the back bay now. It helps the aircraft, it's a safer operation for us, and it helps the community in whole.
That was actually implemented
Yes.
formally in October 2017, you would
Well, I
say,
don't know
or?
if the exact dates are there, but yeah,
But,
it was
I mean,
about
around that
time
time.
that we started utilizing the back bay.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, you bet.
keep
As
Are
far as
there-
the 3,000 is concerned,
All right.
all the ear tough controllers here in RSW and are wholly aware of 3,000. They get trained all the time about it, if not refresher training once a year, more than that. And my guys are trained that if they ever cross the island more than 3,000 feet, they have to let the supervisor know. And then they'll research the reasons why. And there's a lot of reasons that go into that, so,
Thank you.
yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that explanation. And thank you, everyone, for your time and your effort and the time that's not seen away from here. So appreciated.
we appreciate the dialogue, and not every meeting is quite as cordial. What's ironic is sometimes we'll go into a community and we try to fix something and make it better, and then there's a whole new group of people that are unhappy, so.
Okay, so just officially, this is now adjourned, and we'll reconvene our council meeting in 5 minutes. Oh, we have so much more to do. I thank you. Oh, my goodness.